Stay back. Her voice broke halfway through the sentence, but her hand was rock steady. The barrel never wavered. It sat pointed dead center at his chest, unblinking as the storm behind her. He could have laughed it off. He could have turned his back and walked. He could have let her fade out right there in the mud, beneath that forgotten railway crossing, while the rain hammered down in sheets, and no siren ever came to save her. He didn't do any of that. Ethan Walker, a Hell's Angel, a former Marine, a man the Pittsburgh police had tried, and failed, to put behind bars 14 separate times. He sank down into the mud beside a bleeding, half-conscious officer and said 4 words nobody in that city would have bet on hearing from him. I've got you, kid. If this one gets under your skin, hit subscribe now and stay with it to the very end, because nothing here is what it first looks like. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The storm had been dumping rain for 3 straight hours by the time Ethan Walker's bike rolled beneath the Allegheny Valley rail crossing. He almost didn't slow down. Almost. Later, when the reporters cornered him and asked what made him hit the brakes, he wouldn't give them anything cinematic. No talk of fate. No talk of gut instinct. He'd just stare at whatever table was in front of him and say, I saw headlights that shouldn't have been there. The lights belonged to a police cruiser, folded against the concrete support like a soda can somebody had stomped flat. The windshield was gone entirely. The driver's door hung open on a hinge bent at a sickening angle, and somewhere inside, the radio kept crackling out a badge number into the wet dark, over and over. With nobody left to answer it. 20-2 years onto wheels had taught Ethan the rule: you see something, you keep riding. It wasn't that bikers didn't have a conscience. Plenty of cops would have argued otherwise, sure, but stopping meant questions. Questions meant a name in a file. A name in a file meant some bored detective with a grudge and a slow Tuesday deciding to dig through everything you'd ever done. He had 17 brothers counting on him to stay clean. He had a chapter to answer for. He had a reputation with Pittsburgh PD that made person of interest sound like a compliment. He pulled over anyway. Later, sitting under the buzzing fluorescence of an interrogation room across from Detective Harris, he'd admit he still couldn't fully explain it. My hands just wouldn't keep the throttle open, he said. I tried. They wouldn't do it. He cut the engine. He sat there 2 long seconds, listening to the rain slam the bridge overhead and the radio keep calling a number nobody would answer. Then he swung off the bike and walked toward the wreck. She was about 15 feet from the cruiser, crawling through the mud on hands and knees, dragging herself away from the wreckage. Her uniform was soaked black. Her right arm hung wrong, pinned tight against her ribs, elbow locked at an angle that turned his stomach. The blood pooling beneath her told a story of time. Not minutes, longer. She heard him before she saw him. Her head snapped up, and even wrecked, even bleeding out, even barely able to hold her own weight. Her left hand found her holster and came up with her sidearm in one motion, so clean, so automatic, that it stopped him cold in his tracks. Don't move. Her voice cracked with pain, but there was nothing weak in it. Don't you dare move. He froze. Hands rose slow, palms open, the universal language for someone whose fingers already on a trigger and needs a reason to hesitate. Her eyes dropped to the patch on his vest. 3 words stitched in leather. She clearly knew exactly who he was. You did this. Not a question. Her jaw was locked. Her stare razor sharp even through the rain and blood and dark, reading him the way a well-trained rookie reads a stranger, hunting for movement, for a weapon, for the lie underneath the words. No, Ethan said, keeping his tone flat. The same calm cadence the Marine Corps had drilled into him for talking down people frightened enough to pull a trigger. I just rode up on this. I found you like this. I don't believe you. That's fair. But you're bleeding out. I can see it from here. And if I wanted to hurt you, I've had 6 better chances already. Silence. Just the rain, relentless. My radio, she started. It's transmitting, he said. Nobody's picking up. I stood there and listened for a full minute before I got off the bike. He watched the calculation move behind her eyes. The same math every cop runs when the pieces stop fitting. When silence starts meaning more than sound. How long have you been out here? She didn't answer. That silence told him everything. Listen, Ethan said, taking one slow step forward. Just one. She didn't fire. My name's Ethan Walker. I ride with the Angels, and I know exactly what that patch means to you right now. But I'm the only person on this road. Your arm's wrong. And you've got blood coming from somewhere above your vest line that I can see from 10 feet away. I'm not going to stand here and watch you die out of principle. You're not exactly my first pick for a rescue. Her voice cracked. Not from fear this time, from pain, from the effort of holding herself together. I'm your only pick, he said. So what's it going to be? Another pause, longer than the last. He watched the gun. He watched her hands start to shake, not from nerves, but from blood loss finally catching up, the shock and the cold making the weapon heavier than her arm could carry. She didn't drop it. She lowered it. On her own terms, Grace Mitchell, she said. And if you're lying to me, I promise you'll regret it. Fair enough. He crossed the last few feet between them and got to work. The damage was worse than he'd hoped. 2 gunshot wounds. One clean through the meat of her upper left arm, in and out. The good kind of bad. The second had caught the edge of her vest, clipped her right side below the plates, and something about the angle told him the vest had slowed the round, but not stopped it. He'd seen this exact look in Fallujah, the kind of wound where you can't yet know how bad it really is. He tore off his own jacket, already soaked through anyway. This is going to hurt. Everything already hurts, she said through gritted teeth. He pressed the jacket hard against her side. She sucked in one sharp breath and went quiet, jaw locked, forcing her body still. Military. He asked, not because it mattered, because talking kept people conscious. No, a tight exhale. Marines. To tour. She didn't make a sound that time. Tough, he said. I've seen grown men cry over less. I'm not crying in front of a Hell's Angel. Somehow, despite it all, there was a thread of dry humor in it. Good. Save that fire. Can you stand? I don't know. Let's find out. It took 3 tries, and none of them were pretty. She hated every second of needing help to do something she'd done 10,000 times without a thought. He could feel the frustration in her, the stubbornness of someone determined to do it herself even if it killed her, which it very nearly did. Stop, he said the second time she tried standing without leaning on him. Stop, you'll tear it worse. Just put your hand on my shoulder. That's it. You're not asking me for a help. You're using me like a post. She studied him a beat. Then she put her hand on his shoulder. They made it to the Holly Dot now. In a cleaner version of this story, there'd be a clear road and a hospital glowing like a beacon in the distance. Reality didn't cooperate. The sat 11 minutes east, but between the bridge and those doors, 2 things happened that Ethan hadn't planned for. The first, Grace went under, lost consciousness for roughly 45 seconds, while he was fumbling his phone out to call ahead. Just slumped against him, dead weight, and he had to catch her one-handed, while his heart did something it hadn't done since a firefight overseas. He slapped her cheek, hard. Hey, Mitchell. Grace, look at me. Her eyes came back, unfocused, then sharpened. Don't do that again, he said. Didn't do it on purpose, she managed. Then stop. His voice came out rougher than he meant. I don't know your blood type, and I am not watching you bleed out on the back of my bike. Stay awake. Are you yelling at me? Yes. Is it working? A little. Good. Keep being annoyed at me. It's helping. The second surprise, a police checkpoint 2 blocks from the hospital, set up because of an unrelated call across the city. 2 cruisers, lights spinning red and blue, officers in rain gear stopping every car that passed. He nearly turned around, thought about it for exactly 4 seconds, ran the math on what it meant to ride a Holly with a Hell's Angels patch straight into a checkpoint at 2 in the morning with an unconscious cop strapped to the back. He pictured what every flashlight beam would land on. He pictured how fast that math could turn against him. Then Grace's grip on his jacket started slipping. Hold on, he shouted. Mitchell, hold on. He rode straight into the checkpoint, What happened over the following 90 seconds would eventually fill for official reports. 3 officer interviews, and 1 very long sit-down between the commissioner and the union rep. The short version: Ethan Walker rolled a Holly into that checkpoint at 2:14 a.m. with a barely conscious officer riding pillion. He stopped the second he was ordered to. Hands stayed visible, and on the dashcam audio that would later circulate through every department in the county, he said it once, clear as day: "She's a cop. Officer down. I need a bus right now. And you can cuff me to whatever you want once she's in the ambulance." One of the officers, a 6-year veteran named Rodriguez with a sister who'd served, later said he made his call based purely on what stood in front of him. His hands were soaked in blood. He'd used his own jacket as a compress. "I could see it had gone straight through. That doesn't happen if you're the shooter. I just looked at his hands, and I believed him," Rodriguez called it in. Another officer got Grace off the bike. The ambulance was there inside 3 minutes. Then 3 officers pulled Ethan's arms behind his back and cuffed him to a patrol car door handle. And he stood there in the downpour and watched the ambulance's lights disappear around the corner. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just stood there in the rain, cuffed, watching. Someone would ask him later if that made him angry, getting arrested minutes after saving a life. He just shrugged. "I knew they would," he said. "I drove in anyway." By 4 in the morning, Grace Mitchell was on an operating table. By 4:15, Ethan Walker was in an interrogation room. The detective who walked in wasn't hostile. Exactly. Michael Harris, 51 years old, 23 years on the job, had seen enough cases to know the story that made the most sense wasn't always the true one. He'd also seen enough to know that a Hell's Angel sitting in his interrogation room, 4 a.m., with a wounded officer's blood dried on his hands wasn't. On its face, a scene that called for open-mindedness. He set a cup of coffee on the table. Ethan looked at it and didn't touch it. "Walk me through tonight," Harris said. Voice trained perfectly neutral. "Told 3 officers already. Now I'm telling you." Harris pulled out the chair, sat, set an open folder on the table. He studied Ethan for a moment. Not hostile, not scared, more like a man weighing how much truth this stranger had earned. Then Ethan told him. All of it. Straight through. No embellishments, no defense. Moving event to event in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who'd learned long ago that the truth is the only version of a story you never have to memorize. Harris listened without interrupting, without writing a word. He watched Ethan's hands stay still on the table. He watched where the pauses fell, and where they didn't. When Ethan finished, Harris sat quiet a moment. "You were carrying," he finally said. "I ran your registration when you came in. License Glock. You had it on you tonight." "I did." "She pointed her weapon at you." "She did." "And you didn't draw." Harris let the silence sit. "No," Ethan said. "Why not?" Ethan looked at the coffee. Still untouched. "Because she was scared, and she'd just been shot, and she was pointing a gun at the last person on earth. She wanted to have to trust with her life." He paused. "I wasn't going to make that worse." Harris looked at him a long moment. "I need to verify everything you've told me," he said finally. "You understand you're not free to go yet?" "I understand that too." Harris stood, slid the coffee closer to Ethan's resting hand. "Drink it. Long morning ahead." He walked out, shut the door, and stood a moment in the hallway with his palm against the frame. 23 years on this job. He'd heard good liars and bad ones. He'd heard innocent men who sounded guilty and guilty men who sounded like choir boys. He had never once heard someone sound exactly like a man simply recounting what happened. He called the hospital. Asked about Grace Mitchell. "In surgery," the voice said. "Touch and go." Harris closed his eyes at those 3 words. Then he went to pull the dispatch logs from the night's calls. The record of the call that sent Grace Mitchell to that bridge was gone. Not misfiled, not delayed, gone. He stood at the terminal, staring at the blank space where it should have been, and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been comfortably filed under open and shut, sliding into a category. He'd spent 23 years learning to dread. Something was deeply wrong here, and it had nothing to do with the man in leather sitting down the hall. Grace Mitchell came out of surgery at 6:47 that morning. The team had worked nearly 3 hours straight. The round that had caught her vest had done exactly what they feared: fragmented, bled internally, close enough to something vital that the surgeon later told Harris, with the flat calm of a man who'd stopped being dramatic about close calls years ago. 40 more minutes, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. She was sedated, expected to stay under 4 hours, but there was a short window in the year before they put her under, when she was still lucid, and Harris pushed his way in to check on her. She said a few words, barely a whisper, oxygen mask shoved aside. Harris leaned close to hear. The call was fake, she breathed. Someone phoned it through dispatch, used a department code. I thought it was real. She had to stop, breathe. Ethan, the biker, he didn't do this. He found me. He brought me here. Harris looked at her. You're certain? I'm certain. Her eyes were steady despite everything. He's not the one, detective. Don't make him your fall guy. She let the mask settle back over her face. Harris straightened, walked out to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and made a phone call he knew, even as he dialed, would rewrite the next several weeks of his life. Internal affairs, he said, when someone picked up. I need to talk to someone right now, not Monday. Now. This can't wait. Outside his window. The rain had finally stopped, and for the first time since walking into that interrogation room, Michael Harris felt something new settle over him. The sense of a man just beginning to understand the true size of what stood in front of him, much bigger than one wounded officer and one unlikely rescuer. Much bigger. And whoever had set this in motion, whoever had faked that dispatch call, whoever had wiped those logs, whoever had sent a 25-year-old rookie to a deserted bridge at 2 a.m. with no backup, had made exactly one miscalculation. She lived. The call to internal affairs took 11 minutes to route to the right person. Harris sat in his car in the hospital lot listening to hold music and institutional silence, the kind designed to make you feel like whatever you're about to say can wait until someone more important finished their coffee. He didn't hang up. Special Agent Diane Cho finally picked up, sounding like someone who'd been up too long and wasn't thrilled about it, but was too professional to let that show. Cho, she said, just the name. A period, not a question mark. Detective Michael Harris, Pittsburgh homicide. He kept his voice level. I've got a possibly falsified dispatch call. A wounded officer who's a victim, not a suspect. A missing radio logs from tonight's shift. I need to know if your office has had any prior flags on my department's comms system in the last 6 months. A pause on her end. Not a pause of someone deciding whether to take him seriously. The pause of someone who already knew the answer and was deciding how much of it to hand over. Officer's name: Grace Mitchell, rookie. 8 months on the job. A shorter pause this time. Stay where you are, detective. Don't discuss this with anyone in your department. Don't go back to the precinct until you hear from me. How long? 2 hours, maybe less. A beat. Harris, the missing logs. Just tonight's shift. Something in how she asked that turned his stomach cold. I only check tonight's. Check the last 3 weeks, she said. Then call me back before you speak to anyone. Anyone. You understand what I mean? He understood exactly. Double quotes, yes. She hung up. Harris sat there a moment, staring at the hospital entrance. 3 weeks of logs. She'd asked without hesitation, which meant internal affairs already had eyes on this department, which meant whatever Grace Mitchell had stumbled into wasn't new. It had been building quietly for a long time, while everyone clocked in and out, trusting a system that had already been hollowed out from the inside. He got out and went back in to check his officer, across town. In that interrogation room, Ethan Walker sat with his untouched coffee, waiting with the patience of a man who has learned the world runs on its own clock regardless of what you want from it. He'd waited out worse rooms than this. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and did what he used to do on a forward base in Fallujah, when waiting was the hardest part of the job. Breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, even. Panic burns fuel you'll need later. And there's never a good reason to spend it early. The door opened at 7 to dot it. It wasn't Harris. A younger detective walked in, mid-30s. Built like he'd been designed for intimidation. Sat hard across from Ethan. Planted both fists on the table and leaned in. Let's talk about what you actually did last night. Ethan opened his eyes, studied the fists, studied the aggressive lean. A man who'd already made up his mind before he sat down. I've given my statement, Ethan said. Your statement's garbage. The detective's name tag read Doyle. His voice stayed low, controlled, but the control was a thin skin stretched over something hot underneath. You think I don't know what you people are? You think I haven't been watching your chapter for 2 years? You ride under that bridge every Thursday night coming back from your meeting house, like clockwork. That's not a crime. No, but shooting a cop is. I didn't shoot anybody. You were right there. I was there after. Is there a difference? Doyle leaned closer. Here's what I see. A Hell's Angel who knows that road better than anybody. A Hell's Angel who somehow shows up at the exact scene of an ambush or a police officer within minutes of it happening. A man with a record, with connections to organizations who'd love nothing more than fewer cops on these streets. My record doesn't include shooting anyone. Records miss things. Ethan was quiet a moment. Then, carefully, did Harris send you in here? Something flickered across Doyle's face. Quick, almost invisible. But Ethan had spent 20 years reading rooms and reading men, and that flicker told him everything. Harris is occupied, Doyle said. I'll wait for a Harris. That's not how this works. I've given my statement 3 times. I've cooperated. Ethan set his hands flat on the table. I want a lawyer, and I want to wait for Detective Harris. You can stay in this room or leave, but I'm done talking to you. Doyle's jaw tightened. He stared. The kind of stare meant to make a man feel small, boxed in, without options. Ethan had been stared down by worse men in worse rooms. He sat perfectly still and waited it out. Doyle stood, chair scraping loud, picked up a folder he'd never once opened, and walked to the door. He paused there, hand on the handle, not turning around. You should have kept riding, he said. Maybe, Ethan said. But I didn't. Doyle left. Ethan waited until the door clicked shut, then let out a slow breath, picked up the cold coffee, and finally drank. Tasted like burnt cardboard and institutional indifference about what he'd expected. But here was the thing beneath all of Doyle's bluster. He'd never once asked a new question. He hadn't been fishing for information. He'd been delivering a message. Asterisk, you should have kept riding, asterisk. Not a threat about a case. A message about a choice. Ethan set the cup down and stared at the wall, working through what it meant that a Pittsburgh detective wanted him to regret saving a bleeding cop's life. It meant she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and it meant somebody inside this building already knew it. He was still turning that over when Harris walked back in 40 minutes later, looking like a man who'd aged 3 years in a single morning. You had a visitor, Harris said. Not a question, Doyle. Harris closed his eyes briefly. What did he say? Told me I should have kept riding. Harris's face told Ethan the phrase meant something, more than it should, Harris admitted. He sat, no folder this time. Just sat like a man who needed somewhere to land his thoughts. I need to ask you something, and I need it straight. I've been straight all night. I know. He leaned in on his elbows. When you were with Officer Mitchell under that bridge, before you moved her, did she say anything about why she was there, what she was responding to? Ethan cast his mind back. The rain, the gun coming up, the excruciating process of loading her onto the bike. She was fading in and out, he said. Said something about being called out there, that it came through as a distress call. Officer needs assistance, he paused. Said she couldn't raise anyone on her radio after she got there, like the channel was dead. Harris went very still. She said it like it surprised her, Ethan added. like she expected backup, and it just never showed. Harris stood abruptly, walked a steps toward the door, stopped, turned back. He looked at Ethan the way a man looks at two puzzle pieces locking together into a picture he doesn't like. 3 weeks, he said, mostly to himself. 3 weeks of what? Harris hesitated, then said it. Dispatch irregularities, calls routed wrong, response times that don't match the logs, small stuff, the kind that looks like a glitch until you stack 30 of them and see the pattern. Somebody's been running the board. Ethan said. Harris looked at him sharply. Controlling dispatch, Ethan went on, routing calls, making sure certain things get a response and certain things don't. He'd seen this exact thing overseas, not with police radios, but with military comms, cutting a unit off from supports by controlling what information moved and when. She wasn't ambushed at random. Somebody knew she'd answer that call. Somebody made sure she went in alone, and made sure no one came looking when she didn't check back in. Harris looked at him differently now, not like a suspect, like something else entirely, something he wasn't fully comfortable with. You should have been a detective, he said, and it didn't quite sound like a compliment. I should have been a lot of things, Ethan said. Right now I'd settle for not being cuffed to the furniture. Harris glanced at the cuffs looped through the chair arm, was quiet a beat, then reached into his pocket, pulled a key, and freed him without another word. Ethan looked at him. You really letting me walk? You're not walking. You're being released pending investigation. Technically, you're a material witness, not a suspect. Harris paused. But I want your number, and I want your word you won't disappear. I don't disappear, Ethan said, standing, rolling his freed wrist. I also don't forget who treated me straight. They looked at each other across that small fluorescent room. 23-year veteran of the force, and a man whose whole history should have made them enemies, and something passed between them. Neither would have known how to name out loud. Her name's Grace Mitchell, Harris said, and she asked me not to make you the fall guy. Ethan was quiet a moment. She conscious? Not yet, but she was, right before surgery. Harris picked up his folder. She said you were the last person she expected to trust, and the only one who didn't let her down. Ethan didn't answer. He picked his jacket off the chair back, still damp, still stained with Grace Mitchell's blood down one side, and folded it over his arm. She going to make it? He asked without turning. Doctor said yes. A pause. If it had been 40 minutes longer it wasn't, Ethan said simply, and walked out. Harris watched him go, then picked up his phone and called Cho back. I've got your 3 weeks, he said, and something else. We need to meet in person. What Harris had was this: 47 dispatch records across a 22-day span showing micro-corrections, individual calls, where the assigned unit had been swapped at the last second, not by a supervisor, not by a shift commander, but by someone with back-end access to the whole dispatch architecture, someone who understood exactly how the system routed calls and could move officers around like chess pieces without tripping a single automatic flag, because whoever did it knew exactly where those flags lived, which meant they'd either built the system or spent long enough inside it to map every tripwire by hand. Cho met him at a diner, 4 blocks from the hospital. She was smaller in person than her phone voice suggested, mid-40s, a face that read professionally neutral without feeling cold, more like still water. 2 other agents flanked her. She set a recorder on the table with one hand and slid a coffee toward him with the other. Before you start anything, she said, understand that this conversation doesn't go back to your precinct through any official channel. Not yet. Whatever you tell me lives in a federal file until we're ready to move. If you talk to your captain, your union rep, your partner, anyone on the inside, you could burn this before it ever gets legs. My partner is Doyle, Harris said. Cho studied him carefully. Say more. He walked into the interrogation room with my witness, unauthorized, and told him he should have left a wounded cop to die. Harris wrapped both hands around his cup. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't investigating. He was delivering a message. Cho said nothing for a moment, then turned to the agent beside her. Pull Doyle's financials, today. The agent nodded and stepped away. Cho turned back. Tell me everything. From the start. It took 45 minutes. She didn't interrupt once. The kind of listening that's an active skill. Absorbing everything while giving nothing away. When he finished, she closed her notebook. How long has Doyle been your partner? 4 years. And in 4 years, nothing ever flagged. Harris stared at his coffee. This was the part sitting wrong in his chest, the part he'd been turning over since the parking lot. 4 years of case files and precinct coffee, and trusting that the man across the desk was cut from the same cloth he was. 4 years without a single crack showing. Nothing I could name, he said. Small things, maybe. Cases going cold faster than they should have. Witnesses getting nervous and recanting. At the time I told myself it was just a job. Told myself I was being cynical when it bothered me. He looked up. Turns out I wasn't being cynical enough. Cho held his gaze. You're being honest with me right now. I've been honest with everyone all morning, Harris said, starting to feel like the minority position. For the first time, something crossed her professional stillness that might have been respect. There are 7 names on a preliminary list, she said. Officers we've had eyes on, not confirmed. Watched, she paused. Doyle is number 3. Harris absorbed that. Number 1. Cho weighed something internally. How much to give a precinct detective she'd known 2 hours, and made her decision. Commander Richard Vorse, she said. Your department's head of tactical operations. Harris's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Vorse, 19 years on the force. The man who delivered the commencement address at 6 straight academy graduations. Who'd stood at the back of every line of duty funeral for a decade, arms folded, face grave, dress uniform pressed razor sharp. Who'd given the speech at Grace Mitchell's own graduation 8 months earlier. The one Harris had heard people call moving, inspiring, everything a young officer needed to hear on day 1. Vorse, Harris repeated. It came out flat because there was no tone available that felt adequate. We don't have enough yet, Cho said. That's the honest truth. We have patterns. We have financials that look interesting but aren't criminal on their face. We have a dispatch system manipulated by someone with deep access and a very sophisticated understanding of how to hide their tracks. She leaned in. What we don't have is someone walking into a courtroom, because we don't have a witness who was actually there. Harris looked at her. Officer Mitchell, Cho said. When she wakes up, every word she says matters. What she remembers before the ambush. Whether she can identify who made that call. She sat back. We need to know if it was a live voice, a recording, or a system-generated call built specifically to route her to that bridge. Because if it was a voice, and if she can name it, she let the sentence trail. She didn't need to finish it. Harris stood. I need to get back to the hospital. Cho stopped him with a look. Civilian clothes. Don't tell hospital staff you're investigating anything. You're visiting a colleague. If anyone from your department asks why you're there, you're checking on a friend. Understood. One more thing. Her voice dropped. The biker, Walker. Where is he? Released this morning. Material witness. She nodded slowly. Keep track of him. Not officially. Just know where he is. A pause. He might be the safest person in this entire situation right now. Because whatever's happening inside your department, he isn't part of it. That's an unusual recommendation coming from internal affairs. This is an unusual morning, Cho said. Harris walked out into a city already carrying the ordinary weight of a weekday morning. Commuters, traffic, a world entirely indifferent to the fact that a 25-year-old officer was fighting her way back from the edge of something that was no accident at all. To blocks from the hospital, his phone rang. Unknown number. Detective Harris. A man's voice, careful, the kind of careful that's rehearsed exactly what it's about to say. You don't know me. I'm going to say one thing, then hang up, and you'll never trace this call. Ready? Harris kept walking. Go ahead. The surveillance footage from the Allegheny Valley Bridge cameras, the 12-hour window around last night, was accessed from inside your department at 3:40 this morning, an hour after Mitchell went into surgery. A pause. It wasn't deleted. Somebody pulled it, copied it, and replaced it with a clean loop from 3 days earlier. Request it through official channels and you'll get the loop. The original is gone from the server. Who is this? Harris said. Someone who's been watching long enough to be scared. The line went dead. Harris stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk, phone still at his ear. Dial tone humming faintly. Ordinary morning traffic flowing past, as if none of it cared about the thing quietly detonating in his chest. The footage, gone. The one piece of outside evidence that could have shown definitively who was at that bridge, who fired, which direction they came from, whether they wore a badge, accessed, copied, replaced. By someone inside the department at 3:40 in the morning, 20 minutes after Ethan Walker was brought in. Someone had known he was in custody, known the window was open, moved fast to seal off the one piece of proof that would have cleared him instantly and pointed straight back at whoever pulled the trigger. They'd wanted Ethan in that room as long as possible, wanted the case to stick to him, and if Grace hadn't survived, if those 40 minutes had gone the other way, it would have. Harris pocketed the phone and picked up his pace. On the 3rd floor, Grace Mitchell wasn't following the doctor's schedule. She'd come up out of the anesthesia a full hour early, stubborn against the grain, the way some people just are, as if her own body's chemistry had refused to comply with anyone else's timeline. A nurse found her at 8:15, straining to reach her phone on the bedside table with her right arm wrapped in pressure bandages and 2 IV lines running, the effort costing her plenty on the monitors behind her. You need to not do that. I need my phone. Grace said it with the precision of someone in significant pain who has decided pain isn't relevant to the conversation. You need rest. I need my phone first. Then I'll rest. The nurse, 30 years into her career, had long since learned that patients who wake up fighting tend to do better than the ones who don't. She handed over the phone. 1 bar of signal. A cracked screen from the crash. Good enough. Grace didn't call anyone. She opened her notes app and, with one working hand, and the focus of someone racing her own body's clock, typed out everything she could remember. The dispatch call, the timestamp, the code used, the exact phrasing. A voice on the line she thought might have sounded familiar, or maybe synthesized. She couldn't be sure. The bridge. The headlights that appeared with no engine sound before them, the detail that had struck her as wrong half a second before the first shot, the way your brain registers *wrong* before it registers *danger*, the direction the gunfire came from, how many shots she thought she counted before she went down. And one more detail she hadn't told anyone yet, one she'd been holding back because she needed to be certain she wasn't misremembering. She typed it out, stared at it, read it back. She wasn't misremembering. The door opened. Harris. He looked like a man who'd been awake 24 hours and received bad news at least 3 separate times, which was accurate. You're awake, he said. Redundantly, evidently. Her voice was rough from the breathing tube, and using it hurt, and she was using it anyway. Close the door. He closed it. I need to tell you something before anyone else checks on me. Before anyone from the department walks in. I need you to hear it, and I need you to know I'm clear-headed. Harris pulled the chair to her bedside and sat. I recognize the code from the dispatch call, she said. The officer needs assistance code. Right format, right cadence, right channel. She paused, breathing carefully. But here's what I know now that I didn't know when I took the call. The specific version used last night. It was retired 3 weeks ago. New protocol replaced it. She held his eyes. I only know that because I was in the room when the update rolled out. The only people who'd still use the old code, the one used last night, are people who learned it before the change. People who've been inside this department long enough that it's muscle memory. Harris went very still. It wasn't an outside job, Grace said. This wasn't civilian. Someone with years inside this department made that call. She held his gaze steady. Someone who didn't even realize the code had changed. Harris sat back, looked at the ceiling a moment, then back at her. Mitchell. How are you actually feeling right now? Honestly, like I got shot twice and had surgery, she said. But my head is clear, and I know exactly what I'm telling you. I know you do. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small evidence bag with a USB drive inside. I need you to get your notes somewhere safe. Send them to an account that has nothing to do with the department. Grace looked at the drive, then at him. How bad is it? The bridge footage has been altered. Accessed from inside the department at 3:40 this morning. She absorbed that. Something crossing her face. Not shock exactly. More the grim satisfaction of a suspicion, confirmed in the worst possible way. So they're still running things. Yes. And they know I survived. Yes. She glanced at the 4-line. At the door. At the fact that anyone in this hospital wearing a Pittsburgh badge could walk through it at any moment, and she had no way of knowing which of those badges still stood for what she'd signed up to believe in, and which had quietly become something she'd never been trained to recognize. I need you to call Ethan Walker, she said. Harris blinked. The biker. I know who he is. She met his eyes directly. He found me when nobody else did. He brought me in when he had every reason not to. And right now the list of people I trust inside this department got very short. Very fast. She paused. He's not inside this department. Harris was quiet a long moment. Already told Cho to keep track of him. Good. She closed her eyes. Opened them again. One more thing. Commander Vorse came to see me before my academy graduation. Pulled me aside. I thought he wanted to wish me well, he said. She stopped, her expression shifting the way it does when someone replays a memory and suddenly sees it differently than they did the first time. He said, in this job, the first thing you learn is who you can trust. Everything else is details. I thought it was encouragement. She looked at Harris. He was telling me something else entirely, wasn't he? Harris didn't answer. He didn't have to. Grace looked at the door again, at the ordinary, terrible fact of it, closed, and the question of what stood on the other side. Okay, she said quietly. Not a word of surrender. A word of resolve. Someone taking hold of the thing in front of her with both hands, even when both hands were barely working. Okay. Let's figure out how to prove it. Harris left Grace's room carrying two things. A photograph on his phone of her handwritten notes, and the weight of a name he couldn't say out loud to anyone in his department. Richard Vorse, 19 years, commendations, funerals, graduation speeches. The man who stood at the back of every ceremony, arms folded, face grave, looking exactly like what everyone needed him to be. He rode the elevator down and, while he waited, did what detectives do when the floor shifts under them, replayed every interaction he'd had with Vorse over 3 years and looked at each one differently. Every case file Vorse had reviewed, every assignment routed through his office, every faint, dismissible unease Harris had felt and talked himself out of. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been right. The elevator opened. He got in, pressed the lobby button, stood very still the whole way down. His phone buzzed before he reached the ground floor. Cho, Doyle's financials, she said without preamble. 3 deposits in the last 18 months that don't match his salary. Each one structured just under the reporting threshold. Each routed through a different account. A pause. He's also made 4 calls to a burner in the last 2 weeks. Can't trace it forward, but we can trace tower pings backward. 2 of them put that phone within 3 blocks of the Allegheny Valley Bridge. Harris stepped into the lobby, moved to a corner, lowered his voice. When, 4 days ago, the night before last, he was doing reconnaissance. This wasn't improvised, Cho said. Flat and precise. The way her voice got when she was delivering something she didn't want to sit with emotionally. They chose that spot, checked it, set it up, sent Grace there alone, a beat. The question I need you sitting with is, why her specifically? 8 months on the job, a rookie. Why not just ignore her? Harris had been circling that exact question since he'd left her room. She saw something, he said. Or she was about to. He thought back to what Grace had told him. The dispatch code, Vorse. She'd been in a tactical training rotation last week. Voss runs at himself. A silence on Cho's end that wasn't empty. The silence of a piece sliding into place. What kind of training? Comms protocols. Dispatch architecture. How the department writes high-priority calls. Harris leaned against the wall. If she sat in a room with Voss for a week, while he walked them through the system, if she saw something she wasn't supposed to see, or asked the wrong question, she wouldn't even have known it was the wrong question. Cho finished. No, Harris said. She'd have thought she was just being thorough. He closed his eyes a second. Grace Mitchell, 8 months on the job, sitting in a training room, asking careful questions because that's who she was, never knowing every one of them was, being logged by a man who'd spent 19 years, making sure nobody looked closely enough to understand what they were seeing. She's smart, Cho, really smart. I think Voss saw that. He moved fast, Cho said. He's been managing this 4 years. Fast is easy when you've already built the machinery. Okay. Her tone shifted. Decisive, tactical. I need 48 hours. We're requesting federal authorization for a full wire on Voss and Doyle. It takes time, and I need it airtight. If this goes to trial, I don't want one piece of evidence challenged on procedure. Can you keep Mitchell safe for 48 hours without tipping anyone in the department? Working on it. Work faster. A pause. And Harris, tell me you didn't leave Mitchell under a standard duty officer for protection. He hadn't. He'd told the hospital to list her under an alias, family, only visitor access. But the department's own duty log would still show she was alive. Anyone wanting to find her only needed to pull her hospital assignment from the system. I need to move her, he said. Yes, Cho said. You do. He hung up. Stood in that corner for 4 full seconds, running through who on his floor was actually clean. Not just uninvolved, but clean. Who could he trust to put a body between Grace Mitchell and whatever came next without alerting the wrong person? The list was short, practically non-existent. Then, with the strange clarity of a thought arriving from a direction he hadn't expected, he thought of Ethan Walker. He dialed the number Ethan had left before walking out of the interrogation room. Ethan picked up on the second ring. Harris, where are you? My place. Why? I need a favor, Harris said. And I need you to understand something before I ask it. This isn't official. Not a department request. I'm calling as a private citizen asking another private citizen for help. Whatever you do with this, the department has zero knowledge of it. A pause. Strange way for a detective to open a call. Strange warning. Harris pressed on. Mitchell needs to be moved today, quietly, in a way that doesn't touch any channel someone with system access could track. He let that land. I don't have anyone in the department I can use right now that I trust. Longer pause this time. So you're calling a Hell's Angel? I'm calling the person who already proved he'll do the right thing when the wrong thing would be easier. Ethan's silence was brief. Whatever calculation he was running moved fast. What do you need? A vehicle not registered to anyone connected to the department. Somewhere safe that isn't a hotel, isn't a precinct, isn't anywhere a database search would find her. And people around it, I can be reasonably sure aren't on somebody's payroll. You're describing a Hell's Angel safe house, Ethan said. I'm describing whatever you've got that fits the requirements. Those are the same thing. Yes, Harris said. I know. Another pause. You understand what you're asking. I understand that if this doesn't work, a 25-year-old officer who survives something she shouldn't have might not survive the week. Harris breathed. So yes, I understand exactly what I'm asking. Do you understand what I'm asking you to risk? Give me 2 hours, Ethan said, and hung up. Harris stood in the lobby, staring at the phone. Then he went back upstairs to tell Grace Mitchell that her security detail for the next 2 days was going to be a motorcycle club, and that she'd have to decide whether her trust in Ethan Walker stretched to every man who rode beside him. Grace heard him out without interrupting. When he finished, She stared at the ceiling with the specific expression of someone processing something both absurd and completely logical. "The Hells Angels," she said. "The local chapter. Walker's people. I've spent 8 months learning how to arrest those people. I know. And now you want me to let them babysit me?" "I want you to stay alive," Harris said. "Right now that means staying invisible. And they can do invisible better than we can." She looked at him. "You trust Walker?" "I trust what he's done," Harris said carefully. "Which is more than I can say for several people I've worked alongside 4 years. Grace looked down at the 4 line, the pressure wrap on her arm, taking full inventory with the plain honesty of someone who no longer has the luxury of comfortable assumptions. "Okay," she said. Same word as before, same tone, same weight of decision behind it. "But I want to talk to him myself before we move." "Fair enough." Harris called Ethan back, explained. A brief silence, then, "Put her on." He handed the phone to Grace. She held it with her good hand. "Walker, Mitchell." His voice was exactly as she remembered from under the bridge, flat. No performance. Nothing manufactured for her benefit. "Harris says you want to talk. I want to know one thing. Last night, you could have kept riding. You knew exactly what would happen if you stopped. So tell me why you didn't." A pause, not hesitation. The pause of a man who doesn't usually explain himself, being asked sincerely to try. "Because you were alive," Ethan said. "And you were about to stop being alive if nobody did something. That's it. There's no better answer than that." Grace was quiet a moment. "That's actually a pretty good answer." "I know," he said. "Now let's figure out how to keep you that way." She handed the phone back, moving a hospital patient without the hospital knowing, without a police escort, without leaving a paper trail. That, in plain terms, was a nightmare. Harris spent the next hour and 40 minutes managing the logistics through a sympathetic doctor who owed him a favor from years back. A technically valid medical transport form routed through a private service instead of a department account, and a level of improvisation that could either save everything or end his career. Possibly both. Ethan showed up with 2 vehicles and 3 men. The vehicles were unremarkable. A dark van registered to a body shop. A sedan Harris deliberately didn't ask about. The men weren't what Harris expected, which probably said something about his own assumptions that he filed away for later. Quiet. Positioned correctly without being told to. One of them, a heavy-set man in his 50s, everyone called Dutch, a combat medic from the First Gulf War, checked Grace's dressing with hands that clearly knew their business and pronounced, without ceremony, "Fair, she can move." Horizontal for the first 2 hours. No stairs. Grace watched him work. "You're a medic," Dutch said. "Good enough for now," she said. They moved her at noon. Ethan drove the van himself, Grace in back with Dutch beside her, Harris following in his own car, to a house in Lawrenceville Ethan had apparently used before, for situations Harris didn't ask about and Ethan didn't explain. A clean, quiet 2-story building with good sightlines out the front windows, and a back exit onto an alley. Harris stood in the front room, looked at 3 Hells Angels positioned around the perimeter, and thought about how completely insane this would sound in an official report. Then he thought about Richard Voss standing at the back of every police funeral with his arms folded, and decided insane was relative. Ethan came to stand beside him. "You look like you're having a crisis." "Having several, that's normal. You get used to it. Supposed to be comforting. Supposed to be honest," Ethan said. "Comforting's for people with simpler problems." Harris almost laughed. Didn't. Came close. He drove back into the city with the name Voss sitting in his chest like a stone. Patterns and financial structures weren't enough. Neither was the testimony of a rookie cop, shot twice, currently being sheltered by a motorcycle gang. However sound the logic, it wasn't going to inspire a jury on its own. He needed something that put Voss's hands directly on the controls. He got it at 3:15 that afternoon. From the last person he expected. Her name was Sandra Opper, a 12-year veteran of the department's communications division, and she'd been sitting on something for 6 weeks out of fear. Fear that, as it turned out, was entirely justified. She called Harris's personal cell, a number she shouldn't have had, which told him she'd been thinking about making this call for a while before she finally did. "I need to meet you," she said. Not at the precinct, not anywhere near it. He met her at a coffee shop she named. She was already there, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from, sitting with the posture of someone who's rehearsed exactly what she's about to say, and is terrified anyway. 6 weeks ago, running a routine diagnostic, she'd found a script buried 3 layers deep in the dispatch architecture. Somewhere nobody would find it unless they were doing exactly the kind of deep dive she happened to be doing. The script didn't delete anything, it rerouted, in real time, based on triggers somebody had programmed in, badge numbers, location identifiers, incident codes. When conditions matched, it intercepted normal dispatch routing and substituted something else entirely. It had been running 8 months, she said. Since when? Since the system upgrade last spring. Her hands tightened on the cup. The upgrade temporarily expanded back-end access permissions. Somebody used that window to build it. Did you report it? Her look answered before her words did. Complicated, ashamed. Then something harder underneath. I reported it to my supervisor. Next day, I was told the diagnostic had been reviewed, and there was no anomaly. That what I found was a legacy vendor script. She paused. It wasn't. I know what vendor scripts look like. I've been in that system 12 years. Who's your supervisor? She told him. The supervisor reported directly to Commander Voss. Sandra, Harris said. I need you to trust me right now. And I know that's a lot to ask given everything. I need you to write down exactly what you found, every detail. And I need a copy on a device that never touched a department, today. If they find out I talked to you, they're not going to find out, he said. But I'm not going to lie to you and say there's zero risk. There's risk. You already knew there was risk. You've been sitting on this 6 weeks, which means part of you already understood what it meant. He held her eyes. The question is whether you're willing to let it mean something. Sandra looked at him a long moment, then reached into her bag and set a USB drive on the table between them. I documented it the night I found it, she said, before I ever reported it, because something told me the report was going nowhere. She slid it toward him. I've been carrying this everywhere since. I didn't know who was safe to hand it to. Harris picked it up, thought about the other drive, chose, with Grace's notes, and about the anonymous caller who'd known about the missing footage, and about Sandra sitting in this shop for 6 weeks, carrying proof of a corrupted system with nowhere safe to put it down. All these people, carrying pieces of the same truth alone, because the institution built to be trustworthy had been hollowed out by the people running it. Thank you, he said, and meant it with the particular weight of a phrase that's inadequate, but the only one available. He called Cho from the parking lot, gave her Sandra's name and what was on the drive. A pause on Cho's end that felt like held breath. Then, that's the mechanism. That's exactly what we needed. It ties the manipulation to a specific technical event, the upgrade window, and narrows the suspect pool to whoever had elevated back-end access during that window. A beat. Harris. That's maybe 6 people. And Voss oversees every one of them. Get me a copy of that drive within the hour, Cho said. We're moving on federal authorization tonight instead of tomorrow. Harris was 20 minutes from Cho's field office when his phone rang. A known number. The same careful voice from before. You moved her, the voice said. Harris's grip tightened on the wheel. What, Mitchell? She's not at the hospital. They're going to notice soon. A pause. Doyle ran her room assignments 2 hours ago. He didn't find her, which means he knows somebody moved her, which means they're going to look. She's not with me. I know that. They don't. Another pause, tighter this time. They think she's with you. Harris. They're going to follow you. They might already be following you. Don't go anywhere near wherever she actually is. Harris checked his mirrors. Nothing obvious. But obvious wasn't the point. These were people trained inside the exact same department Harris had trained in. They knew how to surveil without being seen. Who are you? He said. The pause stretched longer than before, Long enough he thought the call had dropped. Then, someone who's been inside this long enough to know it can't keep going. Someone not ready to give you a name yet, but I will be soon. A beat. Turn around. Don't go where you're headed. Give it an hour. Lose whoever's behind you. Then go. The line died. Harris drove another 30 seconds, then turned right instead of continuing straight, the exact opposite direction from Cho's office. He drove a deliberate pattern for 20 minutes, changing direction 4 times, watching his mirrors with the focused attention of someone trained in exactly this kind of thing. On the 3rd turn, he saw it. A grey sedan, 2 cars back. It had matched every one of his moves. His chest went cold. He was being followed, inside his own city, by people from inside his own department, using the same techniques he was using to try to lose them. He spent another 15 minutes carefully, methodically burning every counter-surveillance trick he knew, through a parking garage with 2 exits, a route that demanded real commitment to keep following. Eventually the sedan didn't reappear. He pulled into a gas station, parked at the pump, sat there with both hands on the wheel. They knew, or suspected, which meant the net was tightening, which meant Cho's 48 hours were already shrinking. He called her from a payphone inside the station. Hadn't used one in 15 years. Didn't care. They're on me, he said without preamble. We need to move tonight. Her voice didn't waver. How sure are you? Grey sedan. 3 turns matched. Okay. A pause. Just a second. Then, fully decisive, the window for careful deliberation is over. I'm activating tonight. We'll have enough for a warrant based on what Sandra gave us. Not everything, but enough to start pulling threads. Another beat. Harris, Mitchell needs to stay exactly where she is and stay off anything traceable. Can you get a message to her through Walker without using your phone? Yes, because Ethan had handed him a note before he left Lawrenceville, a garage address to blocks from the safe house, and the words, asterisk if you need to reach us without a call. Come here. Asterisk Harris had pocketed it at the time and thought it was overkill. He didn't think that now. He drove to the address. A man he didn't recognize opened the door, looked him over. Harris, yes, hold on. The man vanished, came back a minute later. Walker says come in. Inside sat 3 motorcycles mid-repair and some men at a workbench. Ethan was on a phone call, wrapped it in 30 seconds, looked at Harris. Talk. Harris told him everything. The tale, Cho moving tonight, the anonymous source, Doyle pulling Gracie's room assignment, fast, clean. The way he'd learned to brief a room. Ethan listened the way he'd learned to receive a briefing in the field, perfectly still, fully present, no interruption. When Harris finished, Ethan asked, how many people actually know where she is right now? You, me, Dutch, you're 3 guys. Cho. In general terms. Harris paused. That's it. Then she stays exactly where she is. Ethan's voice left no room for debate. Move her and you create exposure. Stay put and she's invisible. He looked at Harris. You're anonymous caller. You think they're on our side. I think they're on the side of this not getting any worse than it has too, Harris said. Which right now is close enough. Ethan nodded. Then said something Harris hadn't expected. I want to be there tonight, when you move on Vorse. Harris stared at him. You can't be at a federal operation. I know that. I'm not asking to make an arrest. He held Harris's eyes. I'm asking to know it happens in real time. I've pulled men out of their houses, away from their families, to protect a cop none of us have ever met. I want to know it was worth it, while it's still happening, not 24 hours later on the news. Harris looked at him a long moment. A Hell's Angel asking to be present, not involved, not armed, just present, at the closing moment of a federal takedown. There was no policy for this, no protocol, no page in any rulebook that anticipated this exact situation, because the rulebook had never imagined it could exist. Harris made the kind of call he'd been making all day, not out of carelessness, but out of a hard-eyed read on what the rules were actually meant to protect, and the recognition that this particular situation lived past their edges. You stay in your vehicle, Harris said. Phone on. I call you when it's done. I want a position where I can see the entrance. Harris almost said no. Thought about it 3 full seconds. Thought about everything this man had rearranged in the last 18 hours, without being asked, without credit, without a single reasonable expectation of either. Fine, he said. But you're a ghost. You don't exist. That's generally how I prefer to operate. Harris drove back into the city and called Cho. 9 o'clock. They agreed. In the Lawrenceville house. Grace lay on the couch, Dutch nearby with a newspaper. To men she didn't know positioned quietly around the property. She thought about Richard Voss standing at the back of her graduation ceremony. About the speech. About how it had made her feel. Like the job she was walking into was exactly what she believed it to be. Honorable. Worth it. Worth everything you had to give. She thought about how a man could stand in front of 200 people and describe the meaning of service, while lying through every single word. She heard Dutch turn a page, heard one of the men shift his weight somewhere near the back of the house. She thought about Ethan Walker handing his jacket to a cop who'd pointed a gun at his chest, and never asking for anything back, not gratitude, not recognition, not even basic courtesy, which she admitted she hadn't exactly offered in the moment. She thought about what it meant that the man who'd crossed enemy lines to save her was the man the system had trained her to treat as the enemy, and that the people the system had trained her to trust had been trying to kill her. She stared at the ceiling of an unfamiliar room and felt the particular vertigo of a worldview adjusting under enormous pressure, not breaking, not collapsing, adjusting, the slow, difficult way something strong and honest bends toward something truer than what it was before. Dutch, she said. Yeah, from behind the paper. Why are you here? Really? You don't know me. The paper came down. Dutch looked at her with the unhurried face of a man who's had a long time to think about a great many things. Walker asked. A shrug. That's it. Walker doesn't ask for things he doesn't mean. 30 years I've ridden with that man. Never once, in 30 years, has he asked me for something that wasn't worth doing. He held her eyes steadily. So when he calls me at 9 in the morning and says there's a cop who got set up and nearly killed and needs protecting, I ask him one question. What question? How fast do you need me there? He lifted the paper back up. Grace looked at the ceiling again. Thought she probably shouldn't be as moved by that as she was, but she'd been shot twice, running on surgical anesthesia and the adrenaline crash of genuine mortal fear, and somewhere in the middle of all that, a 60-something combat medic had just told her that 30 years of brotherhood meant showing up when asked. No questions required. She thought about her own department, about what 30 years they was supposed to mean, what it was supposed to look like, and what it had actually looked like. At 2 a.m., under a railway bridge, at 8:47 that evening, Harris texted Ethan a single address. Ethan texted back to letters, *OK. At 8:59. Cho's team was in position. 4 federal agents. 3 officers pulled from a neighboring jurisdiction. Deliberately not Pittsburgh PD. At 9:02. Ethan parked his Hollier block from Voss's building and sat in the dark, watching the entrance with the same stillness he'd once used to watch things that mattered. At 9:04. The lobby lights flicked on. Cho's team went through the front door with a federal warrant. At 9:07. Harris called Ethan. It rang twice. We have him, Harris said. A silence on the line. Not empty. Full of something without a clean name. The compressed weight of an entire night. A woman bleeding in the mud. A decision made under a railway bridge that had rippled outward until it reached this exact moment. And Mitchell. Ethan said. Safe. You can bring her in tomorrow. Cho wants her statement as soon as she's able. Another silence. Tell her. Ethan started, then stopped. Tell her Dutch says she's tougher than most of the guys he served with. He wanted her to know that. Harris smiled. Small, tired, genuine. I'll tell her. Good. A pause. Harris. Yeah, you did all right, Ethan said. For a cop. Harris looked at the entrance of Voss's building. Thought about 19 years and a graduation speech and the long, quiet work of building a house of corruption inside a house meant to be built from something else entirely. You did all right too, he said. For a Hell's Angel, something came through the line that might have been a short, dry laugh. Then Ethan hung up. For the first time since 14 that morning, since a motorcycle rolled into a checkpoint in the rain, and a man with bloody hands said asterisk she's a cop. I need a bus asterisk. Harris felt the thing in his chest ease. Not resolved. Not finished. This was nowhere close to finished. The investigation would run 4 months. The trials would take longer. The damage to a department's trust, to a city's trust, would take years to repair, if it ever fully did. But Voss was in custody. Doyle was next. And Grace Mitchell was alive in a house in Lawrenceville, surrounded by men who'd had every reason to walk away, and had chosen, without hesitation, to stay. Harris pocketed his phone and walked toward the building. Behind him in the dark, he heard a motorcycle engine turn over, deep, even, unhurried, and fade away through the city streets like a man who'd finished what he came to do and needed nothing more from having done it. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Richard Voss did not go quietly. That was the first thing Harris told people afterward, whenever they asked, and people asked 4 months. The way people always ask about the moment something large and long-standing finally comes apart. He didn't go quietly, and he didn't go small. He went the way men go when they've spent 19 years constructing a version of themselves, so complete they've forgotten it was ever a construction. He went with indignation, the particular fury of a man who genuinely believes the rules he's broken were never meant to apply to someone like him. When Cho's team came through his apartment door, Voss was in the kitchen. He heard them before he saw them. And he came out already talking, already performing, standing at full height in an undershirt and slacks with the bearing of a man who'd commanded rooms for 20 years and couldn't conceive of one he didn't. Do you have any idea who I am? Flat, not a question, a statement about the structure of reality and how they were about to collide with it. Commander Richard Voss, Cho said, holding up the warrant. We know exactly who you are. Something crossed his face then, fast, not quite fear yet, more like recalibration. A man who'd rehearsed a dozen versions of this moment, finding the real one, didn't match any of them. He looked at the warrant, at Cho's badge, at the 3 agents behind her, the local officers by the door. Harris watched him run the math in real time. Was this manageable? Was there still a play? Was 19 years of armor thick enough to absorb it? I want my attorney. His voice had shifted, not broken, recalibrated. Professionally, the way a man adjusts when he realizes the script needs to change. You'll get your attorney, Cho said. Right now, you're coming with us. He came. Walked out of his own apartment in handcuffs, chin level, eyes forward. Harris watched him do it and thought about every funeral, every ceremony, every time this man had stood at the back of a room full of people who trusted him and performed grief and honor so convincingly nobody thought to ask what was underneath. The car door closed. Harris stood on the sidewalk a moment after the vehicles pulled away. An ordinary Tuesday night in Pittsburgh, and somewhere beneath its ordinary surface, something that had been running 4 years had just stopped. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. The careful voice. It's done, it said. I saw the vehicles. Who are you? Harris said, for the 3rd time. He was going to keep asking until he got an answer, and something told him tonight might finally be the night. A longer pause than before, the kind that holds a decision inside it. My name is Kevin Marsh, the voice said. Patrol officer, 9 years. I've been building a file on Voss and Doyle for 14 months. A breath. I didn't know who to give it to. I didn't know who was clean. Every time I thought I'd found someone, something happened that made me pull back. 14 months of documentation. Alone. Yes. Alone, yes. A pause carrying the full weight of what alone had cost him. I have a wife and 2 kids, detective. I needed to be sure before I put my name on anything. Completely sure. Harris understood that completely, and without judgment. I need to meet you, I know. Tomorrow. Wherever you say morning. Same diner I used this morning. You'll find it. The line went dead. Harris pocketed the phone, looked up at the overcast sky, the city light bouncing off low clouds, the way it always did, giving the night that flat ambient glow Pittsburgh wears at this hour. He thought about 14 months. A patrol officer carrying a file through more than a year of solitary fear. Watching the system meant to protect people get used against them. Hunting for the one person safe enough to hand it to. All these people, carrying pieces of the same truth. Sandra with her drive, Marsh with his file, Grace with her notes. The anonymous caller who'd warned him about the footage, who he now understood had been Marsh, feeling his way toward trust before he was ready to give a name. None of them able to carry it alone all the way to the end, but together, without even knowing they were together. They'd carried it far enough. He drove to the diner, sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee he didn't need, and let the last 19 hours settle through him in layers. The way adrenaline settles, once the body finally accepts the crisis has passed. His phone buzzed. Grace, texting from a burner Dutch had provided. Asterisk Harris, did it happen? Asterisk he typed back. Asterisk yes. Vos is in custody. You're safe. Asterisk 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, asterisk Doyle. Asterisk tomorrow. Asterisk he typed. Asterisk chose building on tonight's arrest. He doesn't know we have Voss yet. Asterisk a pause. Asterisk tell me when it's Doyle. I want to know. Asterisk you'll know. Asterisk another pause, longer this time. Asterisk thank Dutch for me, and the others. Asterisk Harris looked at that a moment, a cop thanking a Hell's Angels chapter for keeping her alive. He thought about how that sentence would have sounded 48 hours earlier. He thought about everything that had to break and be rebuilt for it to now simply read as true. Asterisk I'll tell them. Asterisk he typed dot. He set the phone down, drank his coffee, and thought about what came next. Because what came next didn't have the clean adrenaline of crisis behind it. What came next was testimony, depositions, evidence review, and the slow grinding machinery of federal prosecution, which ran on its own schedule and answered to no one's urgency. What came next was the unglamorous, patient work of dismantling something built brick by brick over nearly 2 decades, and before any of that, the part Harris had been dreading since. Cho first said Doyle's name. 4 years. He finished his coffee, drove home, slept 4 hours, and was back at the diner at 7:55 the next morning when Kevin Marsh walked in. Marsh was younger than his voice suggested, mid-30s, compact, with the kind of eyes that never stop reading a room. He sat across from Harris, set a sealed envelope on the table, folded his hands over it. Everything I have is in there, he said. Copies exist in 3 other places. If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Harris said. You couldn't have guaranteed that yesterday. Steady, not hostile. No, Harris agreed. I couldn't have. He picked up the envelope. 14 months. 14 months. Marsh wrapped his hands around a coffee cup the waitress had set down and asked. He stared at the table a moment. The look of someone organizing a story that's taken the shape of everywhere it's been stored inside him. A witness, he said finally. 14 months ago. Aggravated assault case, East Liberty. Good witness, solid. Saw the whole thing. Willing to testify. No reason to walk it back, he paused. 2 days before trial, she calls the DA's office and says she's out. Completely reversed. Wouldn't say why. He looked up. I went to see her. She wouldn't open the door, but I could hear her on the other side. And she said one thing before telling me to leave. She said, I'm sorry. Somebody came to my house in a uniform. I can't do this. Harris went very still. Somebody came to her house, Marsh said. In a uniform, which means either a cop or somebody in a police uniform, went to a witness's home to scare her into silence before trial. He paused. I filed a report through internal channels. Nothing happened. The report disappeared. He held Harris's eyes. That's when I understood what I was actually looking at. And you started building the file instead of going up the chain. The chain was the problem, Marsh said simply. I didn't know how high it went. I still don't, completely. I know about Vorse and Doyle. I don't know if there are others. That's what scared me most, not knowing where the edges were. Harris opened the envelope. A neatly organized table. Incidents, dates, case numbers, observations. 14 months of careful, disciplined documentation, written in the same plain style as Marsh's voice. Not dramatic, just true. This is good work, Harris said. It's terrifying work, Marsh said. You know what it's like to sit in a briefing with your commander, knowing what you know, and having to sit there and nod. No, Harris said. But I know what it's like to find out your partner wasn't who you thought he was. That's its own version of it. Marsh looked at him. Doyle. Harris confirmed. Marsh nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. Not satisfaction, more the grim recognition of a pattern confirming itself. I wasn't sure about Doyle. Had him adjacent to two things, but nothing direct. He's direct enough. Cho's got his financials, and tower pings that put his phone near the bridge. Harris paused. He walked into my interrogation room the morning after the ambush and told my material witness he should have let Mitchell die. Marsh's jaw tightened. He knew she'd survived. Within hours, Harris said. Before the department officially knew, the implications moved across Marsh's face in real time. Understanding what it meant that Doyle had been in contact with whoever ordered the ambush, that however long it had taken for Grace to reach that bridge, however long the surgery had run, Doyle had been sitting there waiting for confirmation it was over. And then it wasn't over, and he'd gone straight to the interrogation room to find out what the biker knew. He went to check on loose ends, Marsh said. Yeah, Harris said. Marsh looked at his coffee. God. Harris called Cho at 9:15 and read her the relevant sections of Marsh's file. She stayed quiet through most of it. The careful quiet of someone storing information after none of them reacting to it. When he finished, she said, "Bring Marsh in today. I want him on record before anyone in the department realizes Vorse didn't show up for work." How long before they notice? His assistant would have called by 8, Cho said. So they've had an hour, maybe less, to react. A pause. Harris, Doyle's going to know something's wrong by noon, if not sooner. If he runs, he won't run, Harris said. He'll sit at his desk, act normal, try to find out from the inside before he moves. That's what somebody who's done this 4 years does. They don't panic first. They gather information. You're sure? I know how he works, Harris said, quieter. I've sat across from him 4 years. A brief silence on Cho's end that understood exactly what that admission cost him. Okay, she said. Bring Marsh in. I'll have warrants ready for Doyle by 2. I want him picked up while he's still in the building, before he has time to sanitize anything at home. Harris and Marsh drove to the federal field office. Harris walked him through the lobby into a conference room where 2 of Cho's agents already waited, and introduced him in 6 words. Kevin Marsh, he built your case. Cho looked at Marsh a moment, then extended her hand. Thank you, she said, with the same directness Harris had come to expect as her default setting. That took something most people don't have. Marsh shook it. He looked like a man who'd been underwater a long time, and was only now allowing himself to believe the surface was real. I just needed it to matter, he said. Needed it to count for something. It counts, Cho said. Sit down. Harris drove back to the precinct, walked in through the front entrance, same as any other day, crossed the floor toward his desk, while the ordinary morning life of the department moved around him. Officers at desks, phones ringing, the coffee machine grinding its endless cycle. He looked at Doyle's desk as he passed. Doyle was there, working or performing working, which from the outside looked identical. Harris had watched that exact scene 10,000 times, and never once seen the performance underneath it. He saw it now, and the seeing of it tightened his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the case, and everything to do with the specific pain of misplaced trust. Doyle looked up. Hey, he said. Easy, normal, the voice of a man either genuinely calm or years into perfecting the skill of sounding that way. Long night, long morning, Harris said, and kept walking. Didn't stop, didn't look back. He sat at his desk, opened his computer, worked on the paperwork investigations always demand, the documentation that turns events into evidence, and watched Doyle in his peripheral vision. Doyle made 2 calls, one brief, apparently routine. Harris caught enough of the tone to read it as a normal work contact. The second call was shorter, and Doyle's body language shifted subtly through it, a stiffening across the shoulders, a change in how he held the phone. Harris couldn't hear the words, didn't need to. Doyle had just learned something. A contact somewhere in the network, noticing Vorse had gone silent, had just told him something happened last night. Harris watched Doyle set the phone down, stare at his screen roughly 8 seconds, pick up his coffee, take a sip, set it back down, and stand with the deliberate casualness of a man who's decided to act before acting becomes impossible. Harris picked up his own phone and typed one word to Cho. Now. Her response came back inside 30 seconds. On the way. Doyle was pulling on his jacket, picking up his keys, moving toward the door with the measured pace of a man pretending he's headed to lunch. Harris stood. Mike, said it the way you say a name you've said 1,000 times. Easy, familiar. 4 years of partnership compressed into 1 syllable. Doyle stopped, turned, looked at Harris with an expression still professionally steady, but carrying something new underneath. Where are you headed? Lunch, still level, still even. But the word had a slightly different quality than it would have had an hour earlier. A note played in the right key on an instrument that's fractionally out of tune. Sit down, Mike. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. Something moved fast across Doyle's face. The calculation, the options narrowing in real time. His eyes flicked to the door, back to Harris, to the door again. Sit down, Harris said again. Doyle sat. Neither spoke for 30 seconds. The department kept moving around them. Phones, conversations, the coffee machine. Indifferent to the fact that something was ending at this desk, Doyle looked at his hands, at the coffee cup he'd set down. How long did you know? He said finally. He wasn't asking about last night. He was asking about the real thing. How long had this been building? How long had Harris suspected? I didn't, Harris said. Not until Mitchell. He paused. You walked into that room and told Walker he should have let her die. You didn't know I hadn't sent you in there. Doyle went quiet. 4 years, Harris said. How long were you already in it before we got partnered? A pause. 3, Doyle said. So low it barely carried. 7 years. Harris absorbed that. 7 years of this man sitting inside a corruption that predated their partnership by 3, which meant that when they'd first sat down across from each other, going through the getting to know you rhythm of a new partnership, when Harris had told himself he was building something with someone he could trust, Doyle had already been something else entirely for 3 years. Did you know about Mitchell in advance? Doyle looked up. Something crossed his face Harris couldn't fully classify. Not quite guilt, not quite remorse, something more tangled than either. I knew she was going to be called out, he said. I didn't know. He stopped. You didn't know she'd be shot, Harris said. I thought it was going to be a warning, Doyle said. Scare her enough, she'd transfer out. Harris stared at him. She had 2 bullets in her. Doyle looked at his desk. I know. She was 40 minutes from dead. I know. And this time the 2 words carried something different from everything else he'd said. Something fractured underneath, a weight that had been sitting on him for the 12 hours since he learned she'd survived, getting heavier with every one of them. I know. The door opened. Cho walked in with 2 federal agents and an officer from outside the jurisdiction. The floor went quiet fast, the way it does when something official and serious enters a room and everyone reads the gravity of it at once. Doyle looked at Cho, at the agents, at Harris. I'm sorry, Doyle said, to Harris. Only to Harris, as if the others weren't there. Harris looked at him a long moment, weighing what sorry covered, and what it didn't, whether it was genuine or whether it was the sorry of a man sorry only that he'd been caught. He thought about a rookie officer, bleeding into the mud on a wet road. And a man in this building who'd known it was coming and told himself it was just a warning. Tell that to Mitchell, Harris said. When she's ready to hear it. Cho read Doyle his rights. He stood for it, didn't resist, didn't perform, didn't say another word. Harris watched from a few feet away and felt 4 years settle into its final shape. Something that would become a chapter in a very long investigation, a name on a very long list of charges, a story a jury would eventually try to understand the shape of. He turned and walked back to his desk, sat down, looked at his hands a moment. His phone buzzed. Grace, the burner. Asterisk, I heard. Is it done? Asterisk, asterisk, Doyle's in custody. Asterisk, 30 seconds. Then, asterisk, okay. Asterisk. And after another pause, asterisk, I want to come in tomorrow. Give my official statement. I don't want to wait. Asterisk, asterisk, Cho wants you as soon as you're able. Asterisk, he typed. Asterisk, tomorrow morning. 8. I'll be there. Asterisk, Harris looked at that a moment. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Grace Mitchell, arm in a pressure wrap, today's out of surgery. 25 years old. About to walk into a federal building and give the testimony that would anchor a prosecution of the people who tried to kill her. Not because she had to, because she'd decided waiting was the wrong thing to do, and she was going to do the right one, on her own terms, at whatever pace her body was still arguing about. He typed, asterisk, I'll tell them, asterisk then. Before setting the phone down, asterisk, Dutch says, you're tougher than most of his guys, asterisk, a longer pause this time. Then, asterisk, tell Dutch he hasn't seen me on a bad day. Asterisk, Harris actually smiled. Not small this time, tired, genuine, the kind of smile that shows up when the worst of something is finally over and relief and exhaustion land in the same breath. He set the phone down and got back to work. The days that followed moved fast and slow at once, fast the way events do, slow the way institutions always process their own failures. By Wednesday, Cho's office had issued warrants for 4 more officers named in Marsh's documentation. By Thursday, the commissioner had called a closed-door meeting with union leadership that ran 3 hours and produced a public statement so carefully worded it managed to say almost nothing while technically saying something. By Friday, the story hit the news, not the version Harris would have told. The news version was compressed, dramatized, cut to fit the shapes allotted to a segment. Asterisk, corrupt cops, criminal network, rookie officer targeted, Hell's Angel. Asterisk, those were the pieces. The whole thing got reduced to. Harris watched the coverage from his kitchen Friday morning with the flat frustration of a man who knows exactly how much weight and nuance is missing from the telling. But Grace's name was right, Voss's name was right, and the fact of the corruption, concrete, documented, federally prosecutable, was right. He turned the TV off. Ethan Walker caught the same coverage from the garage in Lawrenceville, working a transmission with Dutch, not really watching until someone turned it on, and his name scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Asterisk, Hell's Angels member Ethan Walker, 42, identified as the individual who transported Officer Mitchell to the hospital. Asterisk, he glanced at it, looked back at the transmission, said nothing. Dutch looked at the screen, then at him. You're famous. I'm on a scroll, Ethan said. That's not famous. That's a footnote. Pretty good footnote. Ethan handed him a wrench. Hold this. Dutch held it. Walker, you did something. I know I did something. I was there. I mean, Dutch tried again. Not a man who usually reached 4 words that didn't come easily. I mean it mattered. What you did changed things. He paused. I don't want you to just ride past that. Ethan was quiet, looking at the engine. He thought about a bridge, rain, a woman pointing a gun at him with a hand that didn't shake. He thought about the 4 words he'd said, and how they hadn't felt like a decision in the moment, just a statement of fact, something inevitable. She was alive, he said. I've said it before. She was alive and about to stop being alive. That's not heroism. That's just math. The math was right, Dutch said. Ethan took the wrench back. Yeah, he said. It was. His phone rang. Harris, detective. Harris's voice had the quality of someone who'd been through something long and had come out the other side. Not untouched, but intact. Grace gives her official statement tomorrow morning. Wanted you to know. She's up for it already. Nobody managed to talk her out of it. Ethan made a sound almost like a laugh. How's she recovering? Stubborn about it. A pause. She asked me to tell you something. Ethan waited, she said. Harris paused, and Ethan could hear the slight shift in his voice that meant he was reading something, maybe a note. Tell him I owe him one. And I always pay what I owe. Ethan was quiet a moment. Tell her she doesn't owe me anything. Told her you'd say that. She said to tell you she disagrees. She's wrong. I'll pass it along. She probably tell you herself. Harris paused. There's going to be a commendation for you from the department. Careful. Like someone delivering news unsure how you'll land. Ethan was quiet 3 full seconds. No. Walker, a no commendation. No medal. No ceremony. Flat. Certain. I don't want anything from the department. Not now. Not after. Told Cho you'd say that too. Then you already know my answer. A pause. I don't need the department telling me whether what I did was right, Ethan said. I already know. I know, Harris said. I'm not arguing. A beat. For what it's worth, I think you're right. Some things don't need a ceremony. They just need to have happened. The line held quiet a moment, the ambient sound of 2 people who'd been through something together, holding it between them without needing to describe it. Harris, yeah, when this is all over, trials, testimony, all of it, come find me. I'll buy you a beer. A brief pause. I don't usually drink with Hell's Angels. I don't usually protect police officers, Ethan said. Guess we're both expanding our range. Harris laughed that time, short and real. The laugh of a man who'd earned it by surviving the last 72 hours. I'll find you. The call ended. Ethan pocketed the phone and went back to work. Outside the garage, Pittsburgh carried on in its ordinary way. Traffic, weather, the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. Downtown, in a federal building, Richard Voss sat with his attorney, staring at the documentation Cho had assembled, understanding for the first time that the architecture he'd spent decades building was collapsing at every joint simultaneously. In a holding facility, Michael Doyle sat with 2 words echoing. Tell Mitchell trying to figure out what was even supposed to mean when it had to be carried all the way to a woman he'd helped put in the ground and somehow hadn't. And in Lawrenceville, Grace Mitchell slept 14 hours straight and woke with sunlight full in the window and Dutch asleep in the chair across the room, a paperback open on his chest. She lay there a moment, just breathing in and out, steady and even, the most ordinary thing in the world, and thought about how close she'd come to not doing it at all. She thought about Ethan Walker's voice in the dark. I've got you. Kid. She thought about what it meant to be seen, exactly when you needed seeing, by someone who had every reason to pass you by. She thought about her statement tomorrow, how she was going to tell the truth, all of it, clearly and completely, the way she'd been trained to, the way she believed in, and how, once her arm allowed it, once the paperwork cleared, she was going to put her uniform back on and go back to the job she'd chosen, because the corruption of some people inside a system wasn't the same thing as the corruption of the system itself, and she wasn't willing to let the worst version of the thing define what the thing actually was. It was still worth it. The job was still worth it. She looked at Dutch, asleep in his chair. She looked at the ceiling. Okay. She thought, not defeat, not relief, decision. The word she kept coming back to. The word that meant she was still here, still choosing, still moving forward into whatever came next. Dutch's paperback slid off his chest. He jerked awake, looked at her. You're up. I'm up. He rubbed his face, glanced at the window. How do you feel? She took inventory. The arm a manageable pain. The side, worse, but manageable. The rest of her, the parts that weren't physical, felt like something broken and knitting back together a long cleaner alliance than before. Better, she said. I feel better. Dutch nodded, found his page, went back to reading. Grace looked at the ceiling and felt the plain, enormous fact of being alive, not dramatic, not cinematic, just true, and let it settle over her like something she'd carry forward, not a burden, a foundation, the ground beneath everything else that was coming. Tomorrow she'd walk into a federal building and tell the truth. The day after that, she'd figure out what came next. Grace Mitchell walked into the federal building at 7:58 the next morning, 2 minutes early, which was exactly who she was. The kind of person who shows up ahead of schedule to impress anyone. But because being late felt to her like a small dishonesty about how seriously you took the thing in front of you. Her arm was in a sling. She moved carefully, the way people move once their body has taught them, in the most direct way possible, that it has limits, and ignoring them has consequences. But she moved under her own power, through a federal lobby, 8 days after 2 bullets and 3 hours of surgery had tried to make moving impossible. The agent at the front desk looked up, looked at the sling, at her face, and said nothing beyond Officer Mitchell. When she said yes, he walked her straight to the elevator without making her wait. Cho was already in the conference room. Harris too, holding a coffee he'd clearly had a while. Both looked up when Grace walked in, and Harris's face carried the specific look of a man who'd been worrying about something for 8 days, and was only now letting himself stop. You didn't have to come in person, Cho said. We could have done this at the hospital. I'm done being at the hospital. Grace set her good arm on the table, met Cho's eyes directly. Let's do this, they did. For 3 hours and 40 minutes. Grace gave her statement, more methodical, complete, no embellishment, no omission. She started with the dispatch call and moved forward through every detail. The code, the voice, the bridge, the headlights with no engine sound before them, the shots. She talked through the tactical training rotation with Voss, what she'd seen in the system that week, a routing anomaly she'd flagged to him directly, in a room with 2 other officers, and he'd dismissed as a legacy error. She talked about the moment under the bridge when she understood her radio would never be answered, and she talked about Ethan Walker. She talked about him, the way a witness talks about something a room full of people needs to understand correctly, clearly, carefully, with the precision of someone who knows the version that survives the official record matters. He had every reason to keep riding, she said. Personal risk, legal risk, 20 years of reasons to assume a cop wasn't his problem. He stopped anyway. He used his own jacket as a compress. He put me on his motorcycle and drove straight into a police checkpoint, knowing exactly what that would cost him. She paused. I want that on the record, not as a detail, as a fact that stands on its own. Cho held her gaze a moment. It's on the record. Good. When it was done, recording stopped. Agents finished. Cho shaking her hand with the same direct, unhurried professionalism she brought to everything. Harris walked Grace to the elevator. How are you actually doing? Not the question you ask in the room, the one you ask in the hallway. Grace looked at the elevator doors. I'm doing what comes next. That's the only way I know how to answer that. Harris nodded. Good way to answer it. Harris. She looked at him. When does Voss go to trial? Cho's projecting 8 months. Maybe more. Federal case. A lot of material. I'll be there, Grace said. Every day of it. Front row. Harris looked at her, thinking about what that would actually cost. Not just physically, not just logistically, but the sustained, deliberate act of showing up day after day to watch someone answer for what they'd done, of never looking away, of insisting with her presence that the truth get heard all the way through. I know you will, he said. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. He watched the doors close and stood in the hallway a moment before heading back to work. What came next was months, the kind of work that never makes clean television, but is the actual substance of justice, testimony, preparation, evidence review, chain of custody, the meticulous reconstruction of 8 months of system manipulation into a story a jury could follow. Kevin Marsh spent 60 hours with federal attorneys going line by line through his 14-month file. Sandra Opper's drive became Exhibit A in a federal computer fraud charge, carrying 15 years on its own. The anonymous tip about the tampered footage, attributable now to Marsh, was sourced, documented, entered into the record. 4 more officers were arrested the first month, 3 more the second. Every arrest pulled another thread, which led to another name, another set of financial records, another interview, spiraling back into the center of a network that had been growing quietly inside Pittsburgh PD for the better part of a decade, not since Voss arrived, but faster and wider under his management, his protection, his very particular talent for knowing who was useful, who was manageable, and who needed removing. The criminal organization Voss had been protecting turned out to have interests spread across 6 neighborhoods: illegal gambling, drug distribution, labor racketeering. Nothing cinematic, just profitable, methodical, and deeply woven into the ordinary life of the city in ways it took federal investigators the better part of 3 months to fully map. Grace followed every development. Back on light duty at 6 weeks, desk work, the administrative texture of the job she'd been warned about in the academy and told herself she wouldn't resent. Mostly, she didn't. Even filing felt like being back, like occupying the right space, like standing where she was supposed to stand. Her captain called her into his office on her first day back, closed the door, sat across from her without preamble. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was direct and tired, carrying the weight of 6 weeks spent sitting with the question of what he'd missed and why. "I want you to know I had no idea what was happening under my own roof." "I believe you," Grace said, because she did. Some things you could just tell by how they landed on a person's face. "I should have known, maybe," she said. "But they were good at not being known. That's the whole point of what they built." She paused. "The question isn't what we missed. It's what we build next." Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, more the look of someone who'd been carrying a weight and found, unexpectedly, that part of it had just been lifted. "You're right," he said. "Usually AM, sir." His mouth almost twitched. "Close enough. Get back to work, Mitchell." She got back to work. 3 months in, Doyle entered a plea agreement. Not the first. 2 of the 4 earlier arrests had already taken deals. Testimony that helped build the case against Voss, and leadership above him. But Doyle was the one Harris had sat across a desk from for 4 years. And the news reached him on a Tuesday afternoon in a text from Cho. * Doyle's cooperating. Full cooperation. He's giving us everything. * Harris read it twice, set the phone down, looked at his desk, the files, the coffee cup, the pen he always kept in the same spot without ever consciously deciding to. 4 years of a desk, 4 years of a partnership that had been a performance from one side of it the whole time. He thought about every case that would now reopen, every life bent sideways by a network that had used the machinery of law enforcement as a weapon against the law. He picked the pen up, put it down, then went to find Grace. She was at her desk, going through a file, and read his face before he said a word. "Doyle," she said. "Full cooperation." She was quiet a moment, looking at the file. She thought about him, that interrogation room doorway, telling Ethan Walker he should have kept riding, about how close it had actually been, the margin between she survived and she didn't, about how different this exact moment would look, as that margin had gone the other way. "Good," she said. "Clean, simple." Then went back to her file. Harris stood there a second, nodded once, went back to his own desk. Neither of them needed a longer conversation than that. The economy of it, to people who'd been through something real together, and don't need to perform their feelings about it, was its own kind of truth. What nobody had fully anticipated was the attention, not the managed press, releases from the department's communications office, which Harris mostly ignored, but the attention from inside the building. The way the story of Ethan Walker moved through the precinct, told and retold, growing slightly different with each pass, accumulating small myths around its true core. The biker, the dying cop, the checkpoint in the rain. People asked Grace about it constantly at first. What was he like? What did he say? What did it feel like, having a Hell's Angel save your life? She answered the same way every time, brief and direct, because she'd decided early that this story belonged to what actually happened, not to whatever people wanted to make it mean. He saw someone who needed help, she'd say. He helped. That's the whole thing. It was never the whole thing, of course. Stories never are. But it was the part that mattered, and she kept pulling every conversation back to it whenever it tried to drift towards something more dramatic, more symbolic. The way you pull a kite string back when the wind starts taking it somewhere you never meant it to go. A national outlet called Harris 4 months in, wanting a piece on the investigation, the corruption, the network, and wanting to talk to Ethan Walker. Harris gave the journalist Ethan's number with one caveat. He's going to say no. He was right. Ethan said no, of about 9 words, for more than the journalist had expected, and hung up. The journalist called Harris back. He really won't. He really won't. Can you tell me why? Harris thought about Ethan in the garage, working a transmission, Dutch across from him. That scroll at the bottom of a screen he was barely watching. He thought about asterisk. I don't need the department telling me whether what I did was right. I already know asterisk about a man who'd made the right call at 2 a.m. and didn't need the morning after to confirm it, because he already knew what he'd done. He doesn't need anyone else to tell him, Harris said. A pause on the journalist's end. That's actually a pretty good quote. Wasn't meant to be one, Harris said. He'd thought the story would fade. The way stories do, especially once trial prep stretches into months, and the news cycle rolls on to the next thing, and the thing after that. He thought Ethan Walker would go back to being whatever he'd been before a rainy Thursday night rearranged everything. He thought the distance between a police department and a motorcycle club would close back to what it had always been, not hostile. Exactly, but separate, held apart by history and habit and the practical logic of 2 worlds moving in different orbits. He was partially right, and partially wrong, in a way he hadn't predicted. The Vorse trial opened 8 months and 11 days after his arrest. Grace was in the front row as promised, first day, and every day after. Her arm had fully healed. She was back on full duty. She sat in the gallery in civilian clothes, a deliberate choice, because she wasn't there as an officer. She was there as a witness, and as a human being who intended to see this all the way through. On the 4th day, she stepped out at lunch and found Kevin Marsh on the courthouse steps, off duty, civilian clothes, holding coffee he'd clearly had a while. They looked at each other, with the strange recognition of 2 people who'd been part of the same story from entirely different angles and had never once been in the same room. Marsh, she, sighed, Mitchell, a beat. The awkward pause of people who know each other's significance, but not yet each other. You built 14 months of documentation alone. You gave your statement with 2 bullet wounds and a surgical drain still in, he said. She held out her good hand. He shook it. They went back inside. Harris testified on the 7th day. 4 hours on the stand. Precise, direct. Everything 23 years of training under cross-examination had built him to be. When it was over, he stood in the hallway and let himself be tired for exactly 3 minutes. Then went back in. Grace caught him at a recess on day 11. You okay? I've been asked better questions, he said. I've asked you better questions, she agreed. How's the testimony holding up? Cho's team's been thorough. I don't think there's a hole, he paused. Voss's attorneys are good, though. They're trying to argue the dispatch manipulation could have been executed by any of 6 people with back-end access. That there's no direct evidence Voss ordered the ambush specifically. Grace's jaw tightened. Sandra's documentation puts the script installation inside the window, when Voss had sole elevated access. I know, Harris said. So does the jury. We'll see if they understand what that means. They understood. The verdict came on a Thursday, which Harris noted afterward, with a particular quiet satisfaction. was the same night of the week Ethan Walker had once ridden home through an industrial district, seen the lights of a wrecked cruiser, and stopped, guilty, all 12 counts. The word left the foreman's mouth stripped of all drama. Official and flat, just the word, and the count, and the word again, 12 times, each one landing the same way, clean and absolute, without possibility of being taken back. Grace sat completely still through all 12. When the foreman sat down and the judge began speaking, she looked down at her lap and let out a breath she thought she might have been holding, in some form, for 40 weeks. Harris, against the back wall, watched the back of her head, the set of her shoulders, the one small moment when something released, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone not watching closely would ever catch. He thought about 40 weeks of this woman and to work every day, testifying, sitting in this room, carrying the weight forward one step at a time. Asterisk tougher than most of the guys, asterisk Dutch had said. Harris had passed the message on. He thought now that Dutch might have underestimated it. He pulled out his phone, texted a number that had become more familiar over the last 40 weeks than he'd ever expected. Asterisk guilty, all 12 counts. Asterisk the reply came back in under a minute. 2 words, asterisk good, finally. Asterisk Harris typed back, asterisk I believe there's a BOIOU. Asterisk a longer pause. Asterisk Tuesday, 7 p.m. you know the bar on Penn Avenue. Asterisk he did not, in fact, know the bar on Penn Avenue. He was going to find out. He pocketed the phone and went to find Grace. She was outside on the courthouse steps, in October air gone cold and sharp. The way Pittsburgh air does the moment fall truly arrives. Collar up, arms crossed, face turned slightly toward the street, toward the city doing what cities do, moving on. Indifferent, he stood beside her. Neither spoke for a moment. 12, she said. 12, he confirmed. She was quiet. Doyle's sentencing is next month, Harris said, with the cooperation deal. Probably 10 to 12. He'll serve 7 if he behaves. Grace considered that. 7 years against the weight of what those years would actually be carrying. She didn't say whether it was enough or not enough. Some things don't have a clean answer, and she'd made her peace with that particular category. Marsh is at the bar across the street, she said. Said he'd wait. Harris raised an eyebrow. You and Marsh, going for drinks. I'm going to thank the person who spent 14 months building a case alone in the dark, so that when the moment came, we had something to use. She looked at him. You should come. You have an hour, she said. Patient, direct, waiting for him to catch up. Come, he came. The bar was small, quiet. Marsh sat in a corner booth with a beer he'd been nursing a while, and his face when they walked in together was the face of a man still slightly stunned that the thing he'd built alone in secret had turned into this, a table. People around it. The verdict already loose in the world. They sat, ordered. Nobody said the obvious things for a while, because the obvious things felt redundant among people who'd all stood inside the same storm and didn't need to narrate it to each other. Then Marsh said, Walker. Grace looked at him. I've been trying to figure out the right way to think about him. I don't have a framework for it. Grace looked at her glass. Neither do I, and I've had 40 weeks to work on it. She looked up. Maybe the right thing is to not need a framework. He did something real. That's enough. He saved your life, Harris said. More than once. If you count the safe house, I count the safe house. And got nothing out of it, Marsh said. Not bitter. Just observing the fact of it sitting there in the air. He got what he needed from it, Gray said. Which apparently isn't the same thing as what we'd expect somebody to need. She looked at Harris. He's coming Tuesday. He agreed to a beer, Harris said. That's something for him. It's considerable, Harris said. She nodded slowly, picked up her glass. Marsh picked up his. Harris picked up his coffee, what he'd ordered, because he still had work that evening, and because he was 51, and had made his peace with who he was. Nobody raised a toast. It wasn't that kind of moment. They just drank, sat, and let the quiet of something finally settle over the table. Tuesday came. Harris found the bar on Penn Avenue without much trouble. Arrived at 6:58. Ethan was already there, which Harris was starting to understand was simply who he was. A man exactly where he said he'd be, when he said he'd be there, not for show, but because he'd internalized reliability as a value instead of a courtesy. He sat at the bar, not a table, working man posture, elbows down, performing nothing, a beer in front of him, another already ordered and waiting, which meant he'd decided Harris was coming before Harris had even fully committed to it. Harris sat, picked up the beer, didn't say anything for a moment. 12 counts, Ethan said. Heard. Confirmed. Ethan drank. How long? Sentencing's in 2 weeks. Chose pushing for 25 years. With the federal charges, probably lands between 18 and 22. Harris looked at his glass. He'll be in his late 70s if he serves the whole term. Good, Ethan said. They sat quiet a moment, the bar moving around them. An ordinary Tuesday in a city that had no idea to men at its counter had navigated something that began on one of its own bridges, in the rain, and had only now, 40 weeks later, arrived at its end. Mitchell's back on full duty, Harris said. I know, Ethan said, which surprised Harris slightly, and then didn't. She texted me the day she went back. One line, first day back. Thought you should know. He looked at his beer. Something moving across his face. Private, genuine, not covered up. Didn't expect that. What did you say back? Said good. A pause. She said, I know. Something that might have been a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. She's a pain in the ass. She's remarkable, Harris said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Harris almost laughed. Drank instead. There's going to be a department ceremony, Harris said. 3 weeks out. Honoring officers who showed extraordinary courage during the investigation. Mitchell's getting a commendation, he paused. They want to recognize you too. Not officially, not as a formal recipient, but the commissioner wants to acknowledge it publicly. On the record, cameras, he watched Ethan's face. Told him you'd probably say no. No, Ethan said. Told him that. Then why are you asking? Because he asked me to, and because I said I would. Harris held his eyes. And because I think you should consider it, not for you. For what it means, he pressed on. Every officer in that department will be in that room. 40 years of assumptions about who's on which side of what. 40 years of the way things are. And the commissioner standing up and telling all of them that a Hell's Angel is the reason one of their own is still alive. That matters. Not for your reputation, for the conversation that comes after. Ethan was quiet a long moment. I don't do ceremonies, he said. I don't do cameras. I don't do anything that looks like I'm collecting a reward for what happened. He met Harris's eyes. I didn't stop on that road, so I could stand in a room full of cops 40 weeks later and get my picture taken. I know, Harris said. But, Harris waited. Ethan turned his beer a moment. Tell them I'll be there, outside, after. If she wants to talk to me, she knows how to find me. Harris looked at him. That's your compromise. That's my answer. Harris accepted it, because it was exactly right in the way things are right, when they come from someone who knows their own nature clearly enough not to negotiate against it. The ceremony was a Saturday. The department's main assembly hall, uniforms, plainclothes admin staff, family members. The commissioner spoke, careful and honorific, built for the record. Harris sat in the third row and listened, thinking about how different this language was from the language of what had actually happened. Not dishonest, just institutional, the way institutions have to talk about things that happened outside their walls and outside their categories. Grace received her commendation last. She walked to the podium in her dress uniform, arm fully healed, both hands at her sides, and spoke without notes. She told them about the night, what she remembered, the dispatch call, the bridge, the shots. Then she told them about opening her eyes and finding a man in a Hell's Angels vest kneeling beside her in the mud, what she'd felt, what she'd done, what he'd done. She told it plainly. No drama. The way you talk about something true when the truth is already dramatic enough. She told them what it meant, that the person who crossed every line to save her was the one the system had trained her to distrust. What that had taught her, not about bikers, not about cops, but about assumptions, about the gap between what you're trained to expect and what you actually see when you finally look at a person straight on. He didn't save a police officer that night, she said, and paused, not for effect, but because the next words needed room around them. He saved a human being, and I think that's the most important thing I've learned in this job so far. The room went very quiet. Harris looked at the faces around him, 40 years of assumptions living in those faces, some of them shifting. Assumptions don't break in a single moment. They erode, gradually, under the weight of things truer than themselves. But he could see it happening, moving, making room for something more complicated and more honest than what had been there before. After the ceremony, Grace came outside. Ethan was exactly where he'd said he'd be, standing by his holly, well away from the entrance and the cameras the department's communications office had set up. Jacket on, patch visible, hands in his pockets. He looked exactly like what he was. Grace walked toward him, out of uniform now, change before coming out, deliberate, right? She stopped about 4 feet away, and they looked at each other with the directness of two people who've seen each other at their most essential and have nothing left to perform. You came, she said. Knew I would, I hoped, she said. I don't assume things about you anymore. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one. Good habit. She looked at him a moment. She'd been thinking about what to say for weeks, drafting versions in her head between work and testimony and healing. Care for ones. Articulate ones. The kind meant to capture something accurately. Standing here now, all of them felt like exactly the wrong thing. Too worked. Too constructed. Wrong language for the truth between people who'd been in the mud together. So she said the plain thing. The real one. You didn't save a police officer that night. You saved a human being. He held her eyes a moment. The way he received things fully. No deflecting. He didn't argue with it. Didn't minimize it. Let it be exactly what it was. You did the same, he said. That room with Harris. Telling them it wasn't me. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said. Not everyone would have. That's not my problem, she said. I know what I saw. He was quiet a moment. Then something happened to his face. The real thing, unguarded, sitting underneath the flatness of a man who'd learned a long time ago to show very little. Something that might have been gratitude, might have been recognition, probably both. You're going to be a hell of a cop, he said. Already am. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She heard it for the first time, and it surprised her. Warm, brief, real. Then he reached back, put his hand on the holly, and she understood the moment was complete. Not because it needed to end, because it was finished the way things finish when they've been done right. Walker, she said. Before he started the engine, he looked at her. Thank you, she said, for all of it. Not just the bridge. All of it. He held her eyes one more moment. The last beat of something that had begun in the mud, under a railway bridge, 40 weeks earlier. In the rain, with a gun pointed at his chest and a woman bleeding, and a choice that should have been easy and WAS and single quotes D. He nodded once, started the engine, rode away. Grace stood on the sidewalk and watched him go, the sound of it fading into the ordinary noise of a Saturday afternoon in Pittsburgh, until she couldn't hear it anymore. Behind her, through the glass doors, the ceremony was winding down, people gathering coats, clustering to talk, drifting toward the exits. Harris was visible through the glass, talking with Marsh, both of them carrying the loose-shouldered ease of people finally, genuinely at rest after a very long stretch of not being. Sandra was there too, in civilian clothes, looking faintly uncertain whether she belonged in the room. Grace made a mental note to find her before she left, to say the thing that needed saying, that she belonged there more than most of the uniforms in it. That 14, no, 6 weeks of carrying something alone in the dark was its own kind of courage. The kind that doesn't wear a badge, but should. Marsh's file. Sandra's drive? Dutch's hands on her dressing. The anonymous calls in the rain. The grey Sid Harris had lost in a parking garage. All the small, unglamorous acts of people choosing to do the right thing when the right thing was the harder choice. The one that caused something and promised nothing back. Grace turned and walked back through the doors. She had work to do. Not dramatic work. Not the kind with a clean ending and an obvious villain. And one night under a bridge that changes everything in a single stroke. The ordinary, relentless work of being in the right place, doing the right thing, keeping her eyes open enough to see what was actually in front of her instead of what she expected to find. She thought about Ethan Walker riding through the city right now, about the patch on his vest, and the life it represented, all its complicated, irreducible truth, about the fact that he'd go back to that life fully, completely, without apology, without turning into something the world found more comfortable. He wasn't a reformed man, wasn't a changed man. He was exactly who he'd always been, the man who stopped. And that, it turned out, was enough. More than enough. She found Sandra near the exit, coat already on, ready to slip out quietly, the way people do who aren't sure they were really invited. "I owe you something," Grace said. "You don't," Sandra started. "I do." Grace held her eyes. "You carried that drive 6 weeks, alone, not knowing who to trust, not knowing if it would ever matter." It mattered. Every warrant, every arrest, this whole trial. It all runs through that drive. You're at the center of this, whether anyone ever puts your name on a commendation or not. Sandra's jaw worked. "I was terrified. Every single day." "I know," Grace said. "That's what makes it something." Sandra nodded. Something releasing in her shoulders. The specific release of a weight carried, so long the body forgets what it's like without it. "Are you really as okay as you look?" Sandra asked. Grace considered it. The most genuine question anyone had asked her in weeks. "I'm getting there," she said. "That's the most honest answer I've got." "Good enough," Sandra said. Harris found Grace by the coffee table 10 minutes later. They looked at each other, and between them passed the shorthand of two people who've been through something together they'll spend the rest of their careers carrying. Not exactly a burden, more a permanent alteration. The way a bone knits differently at the sight of an old break. "Ready," he said. They were driving to a debrief with Cho's office, final documentation, the formal close of the investigative file, the last step before the case moved entirely into the hands of the prosecution. "Always," she said. They walked out together, through the lobby, through the glass doors into a Saturday afternoon, doing nothing more remarkable than being a Saturday afternoon in Pittsburgh. Ordinary, ambient, entirely indifferent to what had happened inside the building behind them. The Hells Angels never became supporters of Pittsburgh PD. Pittsburgh PD never officially celebrated a Hells Angel. The investigation ran its full course. Voss was sentenced to 21 years. Doyle, honoring his cooperation deal, drew 11. 4 more officers pleaded guilty. 3 went to trial. The criminal network that had operated under police protection for the better part of a decade was dismantled across 18 months of coordinated federal and local work, and the neighborhoods it had preyed on began, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. Grace Mitchell made detective 3 years later, the youngest in the department's history to hold that rank, a fact several people brought up, which she acknowledged once, and then set down and went back to work. Ethan Walker kept writing. He turned down 5 separate interview requests, 2 documentary pitches, and 1 book deal. Dutch kept working on engines. The chapter kept meeting Thursday nights. Harris retired at 28 years. Good turnout at the party. He gave a short speech and meant most of it. Went home, slept 11 hours, and woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in longer than he could measure. Light, like a man who'd carried the right weight for a long time and had finally, on the right day, been allowed to set it down. Grace kept her promise to herself, kept her eyes open, kept being thorough, kept asking the questions that needed asking, following the threads that needed following, seeing the people in front of her as people first. Categories never dot. And on a Thursday night, 3 years after the night that changed everything, driving home through an industrial district on the edge of the city, she passed beneath a railway bridge and felt, for just a moment, the full weight of what had happened there. She slowed. She didn't stop. She looked out through the windshield at the underside of that bridge, the concrete, the dark, the utter ordinariness of it, and thought about what it meant that one man had looked at a dying cop and seen a human being first. She drove on, drove through the city that was hers, that she'd chosen, that had shattered her faith, and then helped her rebuild it into something sturdier and more honest than it had ever been before. And she carried forward what that night had put in her, not the wound. The lesson. That the right thing doesn't come with a category. It doesn't come stitched to a patch or pinned to a badge or printed on a title. None of the shortcuts we use to decide in advance who's worth trusting. It comes from one person, in one moment, making a choice when the choice costs something. It comes from a man on a motorcycle in the rain, who saw something and stopped. And in that stopping, in that single, irreducible human decision not to keep riding, he changed everything that came after. That was the truth. That was all of it. And it was more than enough to last her the rest of her life. **END***.